Hello, I'm Fionnuala Aoláin, Professor of Law at the Queen's University Belfast and the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the protection and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. And today I'm going to talk about the end of counterterrorism as we know it. So counterterrorism is not new, and neither is terrorism. States have long struggled to address the causes, consequences and harms that result from terrorism, not least because they have strained to find an agreed global definition of terrorism. But in the smouldering ashes of the Twin Towers and the ruins of the US Pentagon on 9/11, a new era of global counterterrorism was born. Some of that was immediately visible in the US invasion of Afghanistan and the clear articulation of a need for accountability and justice for the victims. Other pieces of it, including the now maligned, discredited war on terror, as well as the grim policies of rendition and torture, best captured by the images of orange jumpsuits and men in cages, illuminated the dark side of counterterrorism. It's alongside these images that a more profound global shift was taking place. It was a deep and seismic shift as the United Nations states and regional bodies embraced global counterterrorism. And the question is, what has that embrace delivered us? Well, it's brought us 20 years of enduring and unending violence. It has emboldened and enabled authoritarianism and undermined democracy from within. It has allowed states the liberty to define terrorism on their own terms without interference, thus making the humanitarian, the civil rights activist, the eco-warrior, the women's rights defender a terrorist. Human rights protection is under severe and undulating strain, and counterterrorism has been an active and central participant in that outcome. Civicus, a leading human rights organization, estimates that civic space is restricted or impaired in 111 countries. In 2019, 300 human rights defenders were killed, including a rising number of women human rights defenders. These short snapshots are not generic. They're intimately connected with and sustained by national security practices and the use of counterterrorism measures as a normalized exception across the globe. They are exemplified in stories of women's human rights activist Loujain al-Hathloui, charged with terrorism because she claims Saudi Arabian women have universal human rights, including the right to drive. Seen in the arrest and detention of 3 human rights defenders in Egypt from a famous and old Egyptian human rights organization called the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, arrested for terrorism because they hosted foreign diplomats and briefed them on their human rights work in that country. It is evidenced in the abandonment of hundreds of children in camps in northeast Syria, branded as terrorist affiliates because their parents are believed to have been affiliated with ISIS. Counterterrorism is not making us more free and more secure, but operating as a convenient cover for the systematic violation of human rights across the globe. So, let's inspect this global counterterrorism architecture a little more closely to understand it a little better. After 9/11, the United Nations created a counterterrorism committee serviced by a special political mission, the Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate, to regulate global counterterrorism. These bodies are fueled by multiple Security Council resolutions that have built a global regulatory framework on terrorism that includes literally everything from financing to biometrics, borders to criminal prosecution, surveillance to airline passenger information. In addition, in 2017, the United Nations established an Office of Counterterrorism, an innocuously named coordination mechanism yielding an exceptional budget and increased capacity and power to provide counter-terrorism support and solutions to almost every problem, including those, in my view, that should in reality be left where they are, well outside counter-terrorism, including education, health, children's rights, development, and women's rights. This growing, expanding, and powerful counter-terrorism architecture within the UN is both a human rights light and a civil society free zone. Despite all of the evidence that tells us that human rights and the rule of law must be at the heart of security strategies in order to be successful in the long term and embedded in the long term. States and the United Nations have at best treated human rights as that unwelcome cousin at a wedding, or at worst, disinviting human rights actors from the counter-terrorism party. So the question is, what do we do? Wishing goodwill on human rights will not make human rights magically appear in the global counter-terrorism architecture, as well as in its day-to-day programming. And without a commitment to fundamentally undoing and revisioning the existing counter-terrorism architecture and the strategy we have, we are all facing and watching Rome burn. What does this mean? In order to change it, it means reimagining security and counter-terrorism for the 21st century. I think we need to do 4 things. The first is to rethink security fundamentally. Understanding at a visceral level that 20 years of human rights-free counter-terrorism has not worked and may have been extraordinarily counterproductive, and more of the same will not serve us well in the future. Second, we need a serious debate about the current size, effectiveness, and the added value of the counter-terrorism architecture as it currently is constituted and paid for, and to assess whether it's necessary. In the short term, we need remedial action which is number 3, which would involve establishing a standalone and adequately funded human rights oversight entity within the global counterterrorism architecture and ensuring that it's adequately supported. Finally, and fourthly, counterterrorism without the involvement of civil society is a policy and a practice so devoid of meaningful substance with the implementation of human security on the ground that it is barely worth talking about. And why should we undo, after all of this argumentation, why should we undo the global counterterrorism architecture? Because first of all, it's not working. In fact, we don't really know much about what it does because we haven't paused in 20 years to evaluate it. Secondly, because as those of us who have lived and worked in Northern Ireland know, undoing violence and the underlying issues that propel it is deeply painful and complicated long-term work. And finally, we should undo it because we can do better. And doing better means integrating the rule of law and human rights at every step. This means, at a minimum, that we clearly say defending human rights is not terrorism. Defending women's rights is not terrorism. And abandoning children to life in subhuman conditions in the camps of the arid deserts of northeast Syria diminishes us all and makes us less safe. 20 years after 9/11, it's beyond time to end counterterrorism as we know it, to open up and refresh our toolkits, and to recognize that quick fix solutions to complex problems don't work, and that only when we place the dignity and value of the human person at the beating heart center of what we do will we be secure.